In the quiet hours before dawn, when the roosters of Enugu had not yet announced the coming day, and the world still belonged to shadows and whispers, Amara rose from her thin mattress on the cold concrete floor. Her room was not truly a room at all, but a cramped space beside the kitchen, where the smell of yesterday's stew still clung to the walls, and the sound of rats scratching in the corners had become her lullaby. She was 22 years old, with eyes that carried the weight of 1,000 unshed tears and hands that had known nothing but work since the day her father closed his eyes for the last time. Her father, oh, how she missed him still, had been a good man, a trader who sold fabrics in the market and came home each evening smelling of sun and cotton, his pockets jingling with coins, and his smile wide enough to light up their small compound. But death, that thief that comes for us all, had taken him 5 years ago, leaving Amara in the care of her stepmother, Mrs. Kioma, a woman whose heart had turned to stone the moment the funeral drums stopped beating. Kioma had smiled sweetly at the burial, dabbing her eyes with a white handkerchief and promising the gathered mourners that she would treat Amara as her own daughter, just as her late husband had begged her to do with his final breath. But promises, like smoke, can disappear into the air, and by the time the mourners had eaten their last plates of jollof rice and returned to their homes, Kioma's smile had vanished, replaced by a coldness that settled over the compound like Harmattan dust. From that day forward, Amara became a shadow in her own father's house, waking before everyone else to sweep the compound, fetch water from the well, prepare breakfast for her stepmother and stepsister Adana, and scrub the floors until her knees ached and her fingers were raw. While Amara worked in silence, her stepsister Adana slept in a bedroom that had once belonged to Amara herself, a room with soft curtains and a ceiling fan that hummed gently through the hot nights, a room that still held the ghost of Amara's mother, who had died giving birth to her, and whose photograph now gathered dust in a forgotten corner of the storeroom. Adana was 20 years old, 2 years younger than Amara, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never known hunger, never felt the sting of injustice, never woken in the dark, wondering if today would be the day she finally broke. She was not entirely wicked. There were moments, brief as lightning, when Amara would catch a flicker of guilt in her stepsister's eyes, a hesitation before she handed over her dirty clothes for washing, a softness in her voice when her mother was not listening. But Adana had learned early that loyalty to her mother was the price of comfort, and so she swallowed her guilt like bitter medicine and turned her face away whenever Kioma's cruelty grew too sharp to ignore. The compound itself was modest but respectable, the kind of home that spoke of a family that had once known better days, a 2-story building painted in fading yellow, with a veranda where Kioma liked to sit in the evenings, fanning herself and gossiping with the neighbors about other people's misfortunes while sipping Chapman and pretending she had not stolen every naira meant for Amara's future. Every Sunday, when the church bells rang across the city and families dressed in their finest lace and brocade, Amara would slip away to visit her mother's grave in the old village cemetery, a quiet place surrounded by palm trees and red earth, where the ancestors whispered in the wind and the world felt for a moment less cruel. It was on one such morning, a Thursday in the rainy season, when the sky hung low and gray, like a mourner's cloth, that everything changed. Amara had just finished preparing breakfast, yam porridge with fresh pepper and palm oil, the way Kioma liked it, when her stepmother's scream tore through the house like a knife through silk. Kioma burst from her bedroom, her wrapper askew and her face twisted in rage, her hands waving frantically in the air as if she were fighting off invisible demons. "Thief!" thief in my own house," she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that brought the neighbors rushing to their windows, and Adana stumbling from her room, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. Amara froze in the kitchen doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, because she knew, oh, she knew, with the certainty of a woman who has lived under oppression, that whatever storm was coming, it was coming for her. Chioma pointed a trembling finger at Amara, her eyes blazing with an anger that seemed too rehearsed, too perfect, as if she had been waiting for this moment, planning it like a general plans a battle. 500,000 naira, Chioma wailed, clutching her chest as if the loss might kill her on the spot. 500,000 naira, meant for Adana's wedding. Gone. Stolen from my own bedroom. The neighbors had gathered now, spilling into the compound like ants drawn to sugar, their faces hungry for scandal, their tongues already sharpening for the gossip they would spread through the market before noon. Amara opened her mouth to protest, to swear on her mother's grave that she had touched nothing, taken nothing. But the words died in her throat because she saw the trap closing around her, saw the way Chioma's eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like triumph. Before Amara could speak, before she could even draw breath to defend herself, Chioma grabbed her by the arm with surprising strength and dragged her toward the small room where Amara slept, the neighbors following like a funeral procession, murmuring and clucking their tongues in righteous indignation. "Search her room," Chioma commanded, and though Amara's heart screamed that this was wrong, that she had nothing to hide, she stood frozen as her stepmother tore through her few possessions, the 2 faded dresses hanging on a nail, the worn Bible her father had given her, the small wooden box that held her mother's wedding ring, the only thing of value she had left in this world. And then, with a cry of victory that sent chills down Amara's spine, Chioma lifted the thin mattress, and there, wrapped in a black polythene bag, was the money. Crisp naira notes bundled together, more cash than Amara had ever seen in her life. The compound erupted in gasps and accusations, the neighbors pointing and shouting, some calling for the police, others calling for justice, their voices blending into a roar that made Amara's head spin and her legs buckle beneath her. "I didn't," Amara began, but Chioma slapped her across the face so hard that stars exploded behind her eyes and the taste of blood filled her mouth. "You ungrateful snake!" Chioma spat, her face inches from Amara's, her breath hot and bitter. "After everything I did for you, after I took you in when your father died, and fed you and clothed you, this is how you repay me? By stealing from your own sister's wedding." Amara looked desperately at Adana, silently begging her stepsister to speak up, to tell the truth, because surely Adana could see that this was a lie, that someone had planted that money, that Amara would rather die than steal. But Adana's eyes slid away, her face pale and uncertain, and in that moment of silence, Amara understood that she was alone, utterly and completely alone, in a world that had already decided her guilt. The police came within the hour, 2 officers in worn uniforms who listened to Chioma's tearful testimony with expressions that said they had seen this story 100 times before. Poor girl, trusted by family, turns to theft. Inspector Okan was the older of the 2, a man in his 50s with gray threading through his hair and eyes that had witnessed too many years of Lagos streets and Enugu compounds, too many lies told with tears, too many truths buried under bribes. He examined the money, counted it carefully, and then turned to Amara with a look that was not unkind, but was certainly not sympathetic. "Did you take this money?" he asked simply. And Amara shook her head, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking, as she tried to explain that she had never even entered her stepmother's room, that someone must have put it there, that please, someone had to believe her. But Inspector O'Con had seen the money under her mattress with his own eyes and evidence, as he told her gently while fastening the handcuffs around her wrists, does not lie, even when people do. The neighbors watched from their doorways as Amara was led to the police van, some shaking their heads in disappointment, others whispering that they had always suspected something was wrong with that girl. Too quiet, too humble. The quiet ones are always hiding something. Kioma stood on the veranda, her hand over her heart, playing the role of wounded mother with such conviction that even Amara, through her tears and terror, had to admire the performance. Only Baba Musa, the old gateman who had served Amara's father for 20 years, stood with his head bowed and his eyes wet, because he alone in that compound knew the truth, that evil had won today, and goodness had been dragged away in chains. The holding cell was a concrete box that smelled of sweat and despair and urine, where the fluorescent light flickered like a dying heartbeat, and the other women, 4 of them, hardened by streets and survival, looked at Amara as if she were a wounded animal that would not last the night. They were not wrong to think so. Amara curled into herself on the cold floor, her body shaking with sobs that she tried to muffle against her arms, because crying here was weakness, and weakness was blood in the water. 2 weeks passed like 2 years, each day bleeding into the next, in a gray monotony of stale bread and warm water, and the constant sounds of doors clanging and voices echoing through corridors that led nowhere. At night, when the cell was dark and the city beyond the walls had fallen silent, Amara would close her eyes and whisper the prayers her mother had taught her, prayers that her grandmother had taught her mother, prayers that stretched back through generations of women who had survived things that should have broken them. She prayed for strength, for justice, for someone, anyone, to see the truth. Meanwhile, beyond the prison walls, life continued as if Amara had never existed. Kioma moved forward with Adana's wedding plans, visiting the market to buy lace and beads, laughing with the caterers about menu options, her voice bright and careless, as if she had not just destroyed a young woman's life. But guilt, that persistent ghost, had begun to haunt Adana. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not look at her reflection without seeing Amara's face in the police van, those eyes that had begged her to speak, to tell the truth, to be brave when Adana had been nothing but a coward. One afternoon, while Adana sat in her room pretending to address wedding invitations, she heard her mother's voice drifting through the open window, loud and boastful, as Kioma spoke on the phone to her friend, Auntie Ngozi. "Yes, I finally got rid of her," Kioma was saying, her laughter sharp as broken glass. "That girl was always a problem, always making me look bad with her sad eyes and quiet voice. Now she's gone, and the house is peaceful again. And the money? Oh, the money is back where it belongs. With me. My late husband was a fool. To think I would share his estate with that child. Everything is mine now, mine and Adana's." The words fell on Adana like stones, each one heavier than the last, and she felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been sealed shut with fear and selfishness and the desperate need to be loved by a mother who had never truly loved anyone but herself. Adana sat frozen, the invitation card trembling in her hands, and for the first time in her life, she understood the weight of her silence, the cost of her cowardice. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in her comfortable bed, with its soft sheets and working fan, and all she could see was Amara on that concrete floor. All she could hear were those prayers whispered in the dark, and she knew, with the terrible clarity of someone who has finally opened their eyes, that she had to make this right. But how? Her mother was powerful, vindictive, capable of destroying anyone who stood against her. And yet, the alternative, living with this guilt, while building a marriage on the foundation of another woman's suffering, was suddenly unbearable. The next morning, Adana made a decision that would change everything. But before we speak of Adana's awakening, we must turn our attention to another player in this story, a man who had not yet appeared on this stage, but whose entrance would shift the direction of every life it touched. His name was Chukwuemeka, though his friends called him Emeka, and he was a billionaire, not in the flashy way of men who wear gold chains and drive cars that cost more than houses, but in the quiet way of someone who had built his wealth from nothing and remembered with painful clarity what it felt like to be powerless. He was 32 years old, tall and lean with thoughtful eyes and hands that were more comfortable holding a book than a champagne glass, though he had held plenty of both in his years of success. His company built technology platforms for African businesses, and his wealth had come from solving problems that others ignored, from seeing opportunities where others saw only obstacles. But money, as Emeka had learned, could not buy the thing he wanted most. Someone who saw him, truly saw him, not as a bank account or a status symbol, but as a human being with fears and dreams and a heart that had been disappointed too many times to trust easily. He had grown up in a village, not unlike the one where Amara's mother was buried, a place of red dust and mango trees, where his own mother had sold groundnuts by the roadside to pay his school fees, where he had studied by candlelight because there was no electricity, where he had learned that the world was not fair, but that intelligence and determination could carve a path through unfairness if you were willing to fight. One Tuesday afternoon, Emeka had business at the Enugu police headquarters. He was posting bail for a young man named Tundo, who had been falsely accused of fraud by a business partner, a case that reminded Emeka of his own early struggles, when jealous competitors had tried to destroy him before he could rise. It was while waiting in the cold corridor of the police station, his leather shoes clicking against the tile floor, and his mind half focused on the emails buzzing on his phone, that Emeka glanced through the bars of the holding cell and saw her. Amara sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest, and even in that position of defeat, even with her hair uncombed and her dress stained and her face hollow from hunger, there was something about her that stopped him mid-stride. It was her eyes. They were tired, yes, exhausted beyond measure, but they were not broken. They held a light that suffering had not managed to extinguish, a dignity that poverty could not steal. And Emeka, who had met hundreds of people in his rise through Lagos society, recognized immediately that he was looking at someone rare. He did not know her story yet, did not know her name or her crime, or whether she was guilty or innocent, but something in him, call it intuition, call it destiny, call it the whisper of his ancestors, told him that this moment mattered. He approached Inspector Okan, who was reviewing paperwork at his desk, with the weary expression of a man who had stopped believing in justice somewhere around his 10th year on the force. "That woman in the cell," Emeka said quietly, nodding toward Amara. "What is her case?" Inspector Okan looked up, surprised that someone like Emeka, clearly wealthy, clearly important, would care about the fate of a poor girl accused of theft. But he was a good man at heart, Okan, just tired, and so he told the story as he understood it. The stepmother, the missing money, the evidence found under the mattress. As he spoke, Emeka's jaw tightened, because he had heard stories like this before, had seen how easily the powerless could be crushed by those with even a small amount of power. And the whole thing smelled wrong, felt wrong, like fruit that looked ripe but was rotten at the core. The evidence seems very convenient. Amika observed carefully, his voice neutral, but his eyes sharp. Inspector O'Con sighed and leaned back in his chair, and for a moment the mask of the hardened policeman slipped, revealing the man underneath. Too convenient, he admitted quietly. But what can I do? I saw the money with my own eyes. Without proof that it was planted, without a witness willing to testify, my hands are tied. The law works on evidence, not feelings. Amika nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities, through solutions, because that was what he did. He solved problems that others called impossible. What is her bail amount? He asked. And when Ocon named the figure, Amika pulled out his phone and made the transfer before the inspector could finish his sentence. Why? Ocon asked, genuinely curious now. You don't even know her. Amika looked again at Amara through the bars, at this young woman who sat with her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer, and he thought of his own mother, who had also prayed in dark moments, who had also been powerless against a world that crushed the poor without mercy. I know injustice when I see it, he said simply. And I have money. What good is it if I cannot use it to help someone who needs it? So Amara was released, confused and frightened, and not understanding why or who had saved her, only that she was suddenly standing on the street, outside the police station, with the sun on her face and the taste of freedom in her mouth. A lawyer found her the next day, a sharp woman named Barrister Adeyemi, who explained that a benefactor had paid her bail and wanted to help her case, and would Amara be willing to meet this person? Amara, who had learned not to trust kindness because kindness in her life had always come with a price, was hesitant, suspicious even. But what choice did she have? She had nowhere to go, certainly not back to Kiyoma's compound, and no money for food or shelter. So she agreed, and the next afternoon found herself sitting in a quiet cafe in the heart of Enugu. Her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she was too nervous to drink, waiting for the stranger who had bought her freedom. Emeka arrived exactly on time, dressed simply in jeans and a white shirt, and when he sat across from her and smiled, a real smile, not the predatory smile of men who help women expecting something in return. Amara felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly. My name is Chukwuemeka, he said, but please, call me Emeka. And before you worry, I want nothing from you. I simply want to hear your story, if you're willing to tell it. So Amara told it. Everything. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Her father's death, her stepmother's cruelty, the years of servitude in her own home, the morning of the accusation, the money she had never touched, the cell where she had prayed until her voice was raw. She told him about her mother's grave and the promises she had made there, about the sister who had turned away, about the feeling of handcuffs on her wrists and the knowledge that the world had decided she was guilty before she had even spoken. And Emeka listened, truly listened, not interrupting or judging, just absorbing her words with the intensity of someone who understood that stories matter, that every life is a universe of pain and hope, and the struggle to survive. When she finished, her face was wet with tears, and her tea was cold, and Emeka reached across the table, slowly, carefully, giving her time to pull away, and placed his hand over hers. I believe you, he said. And those 3 words, so simple, so honest, broke something in Amara that had been holding her together, and she wept. Not the silent tears of the cell, but the loud, gasping sobs of someone who had finally found a witness to her suffering. Emeka did not move, did not look uncomfortable or try to quiet her. He simply sat with her in her grief, and when she finally looked up, she saw tears in his own eyes. "I'm going to help you," he promised. "Not just with bail or a lawyer, but with the truth. We're going to prove what really happened, and your stepmother is going to face justice." And Emeka kept his promise. He hired not just one lawyer, but a team, the best private investigators in Enugu, the kind of people who could find truth in places where others saw only shadows. Within a week, they had uncovered a trail of evidence that would make Kioma's perfectly constructed lie crumble like sand. Bank records showed that Mrs. Chioma had been systematically withdrawing money from Amara's father's estate account, the account that should have been held in trust for Amara until she turned 25. The account that Kioma had sworn was empty when questioned by relatives after the funeral. Hundreds of thousands of naira had disappeared over 5 years, used to fund Kioma's lifestyle, Adana's expensive tastes, and now, ironically, Adana's wedding. But the most damning evidence came from CCTV footage from a small provision shop across the street from the compound. Footage that showed Kioma entering Amara's room, alone, at 11 o'clock, the night before the accusation, carrying a black bag, and leaving 15 minutes later without it. The shopkeeper, an old woman named Mama Chidi, who had known Amara's father, had kept the footage because something about that night had troubled her. The furtiveness and awe of Kioma's movements, the way she had looked around before slipping through the gate. Meanwhile, Adana's guilt had grown into something she could no longer carry alone. She had tried to confront her mother, had stood in Kioma's bedroom one evening and demanded to know the truth, and Kioma had slapped her, just as she had slapped Amara, her face twisted with rage. "You will stay silent," Kioma had hissed, "or you will lose everything. This house, your wedding, your future. That girl means nothing. She is nothing. And you will remember where your loyalty lies." But Adana, for the first time in her life, felt something stronger than fear. She felt shame. And shame, when it finally arrives, can be more powerful than love or hate or any other human emotion. So Adana did something she should have done weeks ago. She recorded her mother's confession on her phone, capturing every word of Kioma's admission that she had planted the money, that she had lied to the police, that she had stolen from Amara's inheritance and would do it again, without regret. The day of reckoning came on a Saturday afternoon, at Adana's wedding reception, a grand affair held in one of Enugu's finest hotels, with 300 guests dressed in Asuibi lace and coral beads, with a live band playing high-life music and tables groaning under the weight of jollof rice and pepper soup and small chops. Chioma sat at the high table like a queen, her jewel tied high and proud, her smile wide, as she accepted congratulations from friends and family, her chest swelling with the satisfaction of a woman who had won, who had gotten away with everything. And then Inspector Okan walked through the door, flanked by 2 officers, and the music stopped. The room fell silent as Okan approached the high table, his face grave, and Kioma's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, her voice shrill, as she demanded to know what this interruption was about. "Mrs. Chioma," Okan said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you are under arrest for fraud, theft, and falsifying evidence in a criminal case." The gasp that went through the room was like a wave, and Kioma's face went from brown to gray in seconds. She tried to protest, tried to laugh it off as a mistake, but Okan was already reading her rights, already fastening the handcuffs around her wrists, and the guests who had been eating her food and drinking her wine just moments before were now pulling out their phones to record her shame. Because scandal is the currency of Lagos society, and this was a scandal worth its weight in gold. As Kioma was led away, screaming and crying and calling Amara every curse word her tongue could form, Adana stood and walked to the door. She pushed through the crowd, through the stairs and whispers until she reached the police van where her mother was being held. And there, standing on the sidewalk, watching the whole scene with quiet dignity, was Amara. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Adana reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, pressing it into Amara's hands. "The recording is on there," she whispered. "Her confession. Everything. I'm sorry, Amara. I'm so sorry I didn't speak sooner." Amara looked at her stepsister, this woman who had shared her father's house, but never her father's love for justice, and she felt something unexpected. Not hatred, not even anger, but pity. "I forgive you," Amara said quietly, "but you have to learn to forgive yourself." 1 year later, the world looked different for everyone in this story. Kioma sat in Kirikiri prison, her expensive lace replaced by prison gray, her pride broken by the reality of justice delayed, but not denied. Adana had postponed her wedding, using the time to find herself, to understand that her mother's love had been conditional, controlling, and that she needed to build a life based on her own values, not someone else's fear. And Amara stood in front of a bright classroom in Lekki, Lagos, teaching 15 children how to read. Her voice patient and warm, her smile genuine for the first time in years. Emeka had offered her a job at his company's education foundation, a position that honored her dream of becoming a teacher and gave her the chance to help other children who, like her, had been told they were worthless. She had accepted, and over the months that followed, something beautiful had grown between them. Not the rushed passion of movies, but the slow, steady love of two people who had both known suffering and had chosen, despite everything, to remain kind. They took walks along Bar Beach at sunset, talking about everything and nothing, about his village childhood and her mother's prayers, about building schools in forgotten places and what it means to forgive. One Sunday, Emeka drove Amara to her mother's grave, and they stood together under the palm trees, the red earth soft beneath their feet. "She would be proud of you," Emeka said, his hand warm in hers. Amara smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. But these were good tears, healing tears. "She always knew," Amara whispered. "She used to tell me, 'Daughter, the truth is like the sun. You can hide it for a while, but it always rises.'" And so the narrator speaks now, his voice deep and calm, like the voice of ancestors gathered around a fire. And he says this: "In the land of our fathers and mothers, where the baobab remembers every storm and the river knows every secret, there is a wisdom that cannot be learned from books. It is this: that cruelty may lock the body in chains, but it cannot imprison the spirit of the righteous. That evil may win for a season, but karma, patient and certain as the changing moon, always collects its debt." Amara was like the stone at the bottom of the river. Though the waters were muddy and the current tried to sweep her away, she remained. And when the flood passed, there she was, smooth and strong and beautiful, washed clean by truth. Never forget, brothers and sisters, that those who plant thorns in another's path will walk barefoot through their own garden. But those who plant seeds of kindness, even in the hardest soil, they will feast in gardens forever, and their harvest will feed generations yet unborn. This is not just Amara's story. It is the story of every soul who has been falsely accused, every heart that has been broken by betrayal, every person who has chosen to forgive when vengeance would have been easier. Remember her name, remember her strength, and remember that love, true love, patient love, love that sees you in your darkest hour and doesn't turn away. That love can change everything.